Okay, I'm going to begin. My name is John Fernandez. Welcome to everyone. Welcome to everyone for having joined us. I am a professor here at MIT, and I am the director of the Environmental Solutions Initiative. The ESI is an organization of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, mandated to enlist the faculty and research staff on issues of the environment. This event is the latest in our series, People, Prosperity, and the Planet, which has, over the past few years, hosted diverse voices on the global environmental challenges that are facing us. And of course, chief among those challenges is climate change, but not only. Today, we will be focusing in on the coupled socioeconomic, cultural, and environmental consequences of deforestation and degradation of the Amazon in Latin America. We have with us an extraordinary panel, and thank you to the panelists for joining us. We have two ministers from Colombia, the current Minister of Science, Technology, and Innovation, Mabel Torres, the first Minister of Science, Technology, and Innovation, I should say. We also have former Minister of the Environment and Sustainable Development, Gilberto Murillo, who is also currently here at MIT virtually as a Martin Luther King visiting fellow with the Environmental Solutions Initiative. And we also have world-renowned scientist, Professor Carlos Nobre, who's done fundamental work in the interaction between the atmosphere and the biosphere, and has a particular interest and focus on the Amazon. The moderator for today is Marcela Angel. Marcela is a research associate with the ESI. She conducts the research for us in environmental planning and sustainability. She serves as the manager of Nature-Based Solutions program of the ESI, and she will be leading our work in Latin America. And I want to emphasize on the coupled socioeconomic and cultural and environmental challenges to the degradation of ecosystems in Latin America. Marcela has a master's in city planning from MIT and a summa cum laude Bachelor of Arts in Architecture from Los Andes University in Bogota, Colombia. So I'm going to say a few words and then hand it over to Marcela to start us off. Very, very simple thoughts, but I think useful to set the stage. It is well past time for us to acknowledge broadly the critical role of indigenous peoples and local communities as really buffers against large-scale carbon emissions across the 9-nation network of indigenous territories. That phrase I just said comes from a recent paper, the latest paper that establishes the critical role of indigenous peoples and local communities, published in PNAS recently, the role of forest conversion, degradation, and disturbance in the carbon dynamics of Amazon, indigenous territories and protected areas. That paper happened to have been edited by Carlos Nobre, so I'm citing it for your interest. We know very well that deforestation, unfortunately, the sad story is that in the last few years, deforestation has increased, and in the last year, it's accelerating. And let's remember also that it's not just the full-scale deforestation, clearing of land, but also an understudied dynamic in tropical forests is the degradation of that forest and the consequent degradation of the biodiversity that makes the tropical forest its home. So the ESI has committed to doing work on partnering with countries and organizations to bring technology and the latest thinking and the capacities that we have to reducing deforestation and hopefully also reforesting the Amazon forest. So with that, thank you again so much to the panelists for joining us. I'm going to hand it over to Marcela to start us off. Marcela.
Thank you, John, for the opening remarks. It is wonderful to be moderating this panel with our distinguished guests today. And we will first have short presentations from the speakers, and then we will dive deeper into a discussion and a Q&A session. So we will be addressing questions from the audience. So please use the Q&A feature to submit questions, and we will try to address as many of your questions as possible. We will also have simultaneous translation from Spanish to English. So you can activate the English channel by clicking the interpretation feature, that is the globe icon next to the Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom windows. So now to begin the presentations, I am honored to introduce our first panelist, Luis Gilberto Murillo. Luis Gilberto Murillo is the former Minister of Environment and Sustainable Development of Colombia and has served in many key positions in the public sector. Before being Minister of Environment, he was elected governor of the predominantly Afro-Colombian state of Chocó and served as presidential advisor and director for the Pacific Region Development Plan under President Santos' administration. He has over 30 years of experience and ample achievements in public policy design, implementation, and advocacy, particularly in the areas of sustainable regional development, environmental protection and management of natural resources, and social inclusion and peace building. Throughout his career, Minister Murillo has worked to make the voices of marginalized Colombians heard in the policy debate, both in Colombia and the US, and has built links between Afro-Colombian and African-American elected officials. And as John mentioned, he is a Martin Luther King Fellow at the MIT Environmental Solutions Initiative, where he plans to advance research on environmental justice with a focus on carbon policy and its impacts on Afro-descendant communities in Colombia. So thanks so much, Minister Murillo, for joining us today, and please go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you very much, Marcela, and for that generous introduction. And let me thank Professor John Fernandez, the Director of the Environmental Solutions Initiative, for this invitation to share some of my recent reflections on the condition of the Amazon based on my own experience and the research that I'm starting here at MIT. And putting this in the context of the role of minorities in responding to modern regional and global challenges. And it is really an honor to be part of this panel with so extraordinary and leading voices like Honorable Minister Mabel Torres and distinguished, renowned scientist Carlos Nobre. Is truly an honor. But in responding to some of the questions that I have been reflecting, let me first put this in the context of where I am in this reflection. And I want to make like 3 points and maybe a conclusion. But although it seems evident, the Amazon basin, and I call just the Amazonia, is determinant to the future of the planet. It seems like very evident, but we have to repeat it. As leading scientists like Professor Nobre and others, they have been documented that the Amazonia is nearing the tipping point to become a savanna. We are going in the wrong direction, and we have no more time. The existential crisis involves climate change, loss of biodiversity, environmental degradation, but it goes beyond it. It goes beyond. We have to confront other crises. Crisis of conflict, peace, migration, social inequality, and exclusion. And it deserves special mention to say we need to confront the crisis of systemic racism, structural racism, and racial discrimination as they are reflected in the day-to-day realities of the environmental condition of many communities in the Amazon. Sometimes that dimension is ignored. We may add also the crisis of security, illegal flows of goods and services, and the crisis of democracy that we are facing in countries like Brazil and other countries in the region. And these crises overlap, are global in nature, and affect the Amazonia. The current health and economic crisis generated by COVID-19 pandemic that affected disproportionately, very disproportionately, Afro-descendant and indigenous communities in the Amazon and other regions with very strategic ecosystems. This pandemic really disclosed all these dimensions of what really is an existential crisis, the crisis of a global society and the planet. In this context, the Amazon tells us that we are also in a significant society and planetary transition. That transition can lead to a catastrophe if we don't take the right actions, or also can lead to a transition to a better society. And this brings to my first point. The Amazonia is determined to responding to the climate crisis and in saving the planet. But also, this super ecosystem is under stress. And all events suggest, as we said in the title of this panel, that the Amazon is vanishing. Deforestation and climate change are significant challenges. But the Amazonian natural wealth is critical for the ability to get out of the crisis and support natural ecosystem health and human well-being, particularly human well-being of those humans that in many cases, their humanity is denied. This brings to my second point. Ethnic, indigenous, and Afro-Colombian communities of the Amazonia have maintained this viral and complex supra-ecosystem and biome. Although these communities have preserved this ecosystem, they are rich in terms of natural wealth, but they have been suffering from socioeconomic inequality, exclusion, and lack of voice in search for legal protection to fulfill their basic needs and aspirations according to their own value system. Indigenous and Afro-descendant communities are central to any climate and other solution to the planetary crisis. Their harmonious and respectful relationship with the nature is a cultural expression, is a cultural manifestation of these communities. We have much to learn from them, and we need to recognize that. There are policy innovation, obviously. I led some policy innovations in Colombia. Others did too. And those innovations can promote respectful relationship with communities, and those measures can emphasize equity and at the same time respond to mitigation and adaptation through nature-based solutions. In the case of Colombia, we have a set of tools that I can mention some of them. All of them were in the framework of the peace process, in the framework of the implementation of the Peace Accord of 2016. First, granting cultural rights, prior informed consent, consultation, and legal ownership of the land for those communities. It's very well documented that in collective land of indigenous communities and Afro-descendants, deforestation is less than in other areas that have different kind of legal tenure of the land. It's very well documented. So the strategy of granting land and cultural rights is a strategy of conservation of those important ecosystems. I can mention that one example of that innovation is that we granted almost 1 million hectares to Witoto communities in southern Colombia, in Colombian Amazonia, as a buffer to a protected area, the Chiribiquete Natural Park. And we did this thanks to a strong alliance with these communities and also an NGO called Amazon Conservation Team. Alliances were very important. Second, also, it's very important to grant autonomy to those communities. We created a framework for municipalization of indigenous reservations, resguardos indígenas in southern Amazonia. And it is working very well with the support of the international community. And also technology, how some of the NGOs working in the area and coordinating with the government are providing drones and other remote sensor technology to monitor deforestation and also the condition of their ecosystem, community monitoring of this condition. And we have some economic incentive too. The national carbon tax with an offset mechanism to provide funding for conservation projects. Also, a program Visión Amazonía, Amazonia Vision, that also provide payments based on results of controlling deforestation in order to support conservation and ecological restoration. There are other examples, but these tools are not mainstream development policy tools. They are still in the margin of policy. And it includes also, let me mention that there are challenges, a lot of challenges. One of them is that still communities, particularly in the northeastern Amazonia, have not access to their legal rights to own the land, their territories. And that includes communities like the Maroon communities in Suriname and Guyana. That includes some communities even in the Colombian Amazonia, in the state of Guaviare and Putumayo, that still need to be granted the land. And also, as Professor Nobre knows, the quilombolas in Brazil are fighting for their rights, their land rights, their cultural rights. It is unacceptable. They have been protected, those ecosystems. And also this shows that there are some cumulative effect of injustices. This is an unjust situation, and there are cumulative effects, historical. So one of the key questions that I'm finding in this reflection is how in this era of crisis and transition, we should deal with those cumulative effects in an equitable way that include those communities. It is a profound question of environmental justice for indigenous and Afro-descendant communities in the Amazon, another strategic ecosystem in Latin America. This brings to my third point, which is, and I want to go very quickly, which is current models of development failed. At least they failed for minority communities in the Americas. We need new frameworks, new paradigms. There is a growing consensus about that, growing consensus. These new paradigms should be based on relationships, trust, respect, integrity, should define a shared vision of development and how to implement it. Shared vision of development that is a result of non-hierarchical, non-hegemonic exercise of plurality of worldviews and knowledge. What is the base of the knowledge that you are making decision? I'm talking based on my own experience. I made decision not based on a pluralistic way of having a set of knowledge that was not in a logic of centralized decision-making process. This model has to incorporate fully the dimension of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Finally, in this reflection, I see at least 3 lines of Murillo. One is approach this solution from an environmental justice perspective and deconstruct the pillars of systemic racism and racial discrimination in key arenas. It's like in science, in finance, even within environmental organizations themselves. There are a very new report from Michigan University that only 2% of all environmental organizations in the US report their information about inclusion of racial and ethnic minorities in their staff. The Amazon give the opportunity to respond to this kind of global challenges under this new framework that we need to explore more about them. From a position of community strength and not a stigma, not pity, not deprivation. No, from the position of strength that they have wealth. It is necessary to give priority to a resource agenda that look at the intersectionality of conservation, socioeconomic inclusion, peace, security, and the well-being of those ethnic minorities. In the case of Colombia, we are talking about ethnic minorities that 50% of the land that have the natural forest belong to them. In this context, climate and environmental justice are racial and ethnic justice too. So this is where we are in these reflections, and this is what I wanted to share with you. And I think that this is a growing debate that will continue in the region and globally. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Minister Murillo, for highlighting the interconnected environmental, social, and justice and racial issues in the territory. I would now like to introduce our second speaker, Minister Mabel Torres. Mabel Torres is the first Minister of Science, Technology, and Innovation of Colombia and was part of the Mission of the Wise, a group of 43 national and international experts convened by the Colombian government to create a blueprint for the development of the science, technology, and innovation policy in Colombia. She is a microbiologist with a PhD in biological sciences from Universidad de Guadalajara in Mexico and has focused her research in bioprospecting. Before becoming the Minister of Science, she served as Regional Director of the Colombian Institute for Family Welfare in the state of Chocó and was a professor at Universidad Tecnológica del Chocó and the Director of the Research Center Bioinnova. She also founded the Research, Innovation, and Development Center Selvacéutica, where she has conducted extensive research in bioprospecting medicinal plants to develop biocosmetics and other plant-based products, working with small producers to foster local economic development. So please join me now in welcoming Minister Torres. Bienvenida, Ministra.
Buenos días. Tenía aquí problemas con la tecnología que no me dejaba abrir el micrófono. Bueno, primero agradecer esta invitación del MIT y compartir este espacio con Luis Gilberto y con Carlos, sobre todo porque eso nos permite hacer reflexiones desde diferentes ópticas y un poco conectando con la reflexión que el ministro Luis Gilberto nos hacía sobre las oportunidades y modelos apropiados para las comunidades en pro de que tengamos asegurado también una identidad, pero también una conciencia acerca de la conservación de los ecosistemas. Quisiera contarles un poco sobre un modelo de bioeconomía que se está implementando, que ya tiene sus primeros resultados en el Pacífico colombiano, más específicamente en el departamento del Chocó, que es uno de los departamentos del Chocó biogeográfico, y que básicamente responde a una pregunta de por qué en estas áreas de tanto potencial, en donde tenemos tres elementos muy importantes, que son la cultura, el arraigo cultural, que está muy conectado también con las tradiciones y con el conocimiento ancestral, y que a su vez son territorios ricos en biodiversidad, porque aún teniendo estos activos tan importantes en los territorios, la pobreza persiste, y podríamos dar, digamos, una respuesta desde las intervenciones del Estado, pero esto es una respuesta que finalmente lo que busca es también dar una solución desde lo local. Y entonces, básicamente, el modelo de bioeconomía en principio está centrado en una inversión de lo que nosotros podríamos conocer en principio como un modelo de desarrollo que parte desde un sistema educativo. Y justo en Colombia tenemos aún regiones en donde no tenemos universidades, 2 o 3 regiones cerca, pero entonces nosotros siempre partimos desde que la generación de conocimiento nos puede permitir generar esta conexión con la productividad de los territorios. Entonces, un poco aquí cambiamos la concepción para romper el paradigma, y es, tenemos un sistema educativo y es cómo acomodamos ese sistema educativo para que se puedan aprovechar estos activos que hay en la región. Y lo primero partió de una experiencia que lleva ya desde el 2012, 8 años, en generar un centro de innovación en biodiversidad que realmente respondiera a esa articulación de conocimiento ancestral, pero que también aprovechara esa generación de conocimiento desde la biodiversidad, porque nosotros hemos crecido en estudios de la biodiversidad, y si bien es cierto, todavía necesitamos generar más conocimiento, no hemos crecido en el aprovechamiento y en el uso de ese recurso que hay para lograr, por un lado, generar autonomía económica, valorar los activos territoriales que permitan la reconstrucción del tejido social, pero por el otro lado, que esto conecte con la conservación de los ecosistemas, haciendo un uso sustentable de los ecosistemas, porque finalmente lo que tenemos como historias en muchas regiones de Colombia es que si no hay un aprovechamiento por parte de las comunidades y si no hay oportunidades, pues siempre las comunidades van a estar limitadas, y esto también permite que haya muchísimo más disponibilidad hacia prácticas que no son sostenibles. Entonces, un poco la interacción que se ha generado en el territorio es poder tener un centro que se ocupe primero de encontrar las posibilidades y las oportunidades que hay desde la biodiversidad, desde el conocimiento ancestral, y que directamente lo conecte con un esquema de valor agregado. Entonces, en este modelo lo que se quiere es romper ese paradigma de la pobreza, conectando estos tres activos locales como biodiversidad, cultura y conocimiento científico y ancestral para generar valor agregado. En esta propuesta, entonces, nace lo que yo he conceptualizado como un modelo de empresas globos, en donde el conocimiento es muy importante y trascendental para generar las diferentes interacciones en el conocimiento. Y aquí lo que se busca es, desde un modelo que centra la generación de valor agregado, conectar con una academia en donde se posibilitan los espacios y los entornos para que el capital humano regrese a los territorios. Normalmente lo que tenemos es una fuga de talentos, es una fuga de recurso humano, porque no hay espacios y entornos para gestionar y movilizar el conocimiento, pero por el otro lado también hay una concepción en los profesionales de no estudiar carreras afines con el territorio, porque no hay esta oportunidad de gestionar este conocimiento. Entonces, este modelo inicia primero con, bueno, tenemos que generar valor agregado desde la biodiversidad específicamente, porque es un modelo de bioeconomía que usa además el principio de economía circular y de recirculación de conocimiento para generar más valor a través de los subproductos. Y en esta conectividad con la academia, lo que se permite un poco, y en esa conversación con las universidades y los centros de desarrollo y de capacitación que hay en el territorio, cuáles son esas necesidades básicas que parten o se inician con esta propuesta de valor agregado. Y entonces hay un retorno del conocimiento de la academia hacia el sector productivo y hay una transferencia que permite que el modelo crezca a partir de la generación de conocimiento. Pero por el otro lado, cuando hay generación de valor agregado en servicios y productos, pues hay una demanda de talento humano que nos empieza a construir y a consolidar un pool de conocimiento que antes no existían en los territorios. Y esto también hace, de alguna manera, que haya muchísimo más valor en ese conocimiento porque hay conocimiento más especializado. Cuando tenemos insumos básicos, cuando tenemos materias primas, cuando tenemos servicios que no generan valor, pues no hay una demanda de conocimiento especializado. Y eso es un poco lo que el modelo ha logrado. Por el otro lado, es esa transferencia de conocimiento desde los agricultores, que es uno de los casos específicos, hacia las empresas en una retroalimentación en el que por la dimensión que tenían los pequeños emprendimientos en las localidades, los conceptos de buenas prácticas agrícolas, de buenas prácticas de manufactura, de calidad, no se ajustaban, pues porque no había ese requerimiento. Y ese es un proceso de crecimiento que ha permitido que haya muchísimo más rentabilidades internas al disminuir también todos los problemas logísticos que tenemos. Carreteras, vías, refrigeración, etc. Entonces, lo que se está construyendo alrededor del modelo es un ecosistema. Y para resumirlo un poco, es un ecosistema en donde inclusive la cooperación, porque esto también ha tenido la participación de la cooperación, articula sus indicadores con las necesidades territoriales. Pues lo que teníamos también como historia es que la cooperación tiene sus propios indicadores y esos indicadores a veces no se armonizaban con las necesidades del territorio. Por lo tanto, habían unos indicadores preconcebidos que habían generado unas historias largas de fracaso y de mucha infraestructura y de muchos equipos y de mucha capacitación que se quedó relegada pues porque no había esa conectividad entre esas necesidades. Entonces, esto movilizó, que es un poco lo que rescatamos mucho del modelo, dinamizó una articulación entre los tomadores de decisiones con los cooperantes, con los pequeños emprendimientos, porque también hay que decir, en esta región no hay grandes empresas, son todas pequeñas y medianas empresas, lo que permitió entonces en un esquema inicial de 600 productores una articulación a los proyectos de vida, a los planes de etnodesarrollo y a los planes de vida de comunidades indígenas y afrodescendientes, que ha permitido, por un lado, la dinamización del territorio, por el otro lado, dinamizar el conocimiento ancestral para conectarlo con el conocimiento científico, y se articuló también a un centro de innovación y desarrollo, que fue Selvacéutica, que ha estado desarrollando productos de alto valor en temas cosméticos y en temas fitoterapéuticos, lo que ha permitido entonces una mayor demanda de los recursos y el mejoramiento de los sistemas productivos desde los sistemas agrícolas, que moviliza el conocimiento porque permite también la transformación local, que además genera más valor porque todos esos subproductos pueden ser procesados para tener una segunda y una tercera cadena de valor. Y por el otro lado, ha permitido dinamizar la financiación técnica y tecnológica a través de diferentes alianzas con diferentes organizaciones, tanto internas como externas, que al final mejora, digamos, hace más eficiente la inversión de los recursos. Y esta experiencia, un poco lo que ha disminuido también esa sensación de desesperanza cuando se hacen inversiones en proyectos que al final no hay una rentabilidad porque no se dinamizan las cadenas de valor. Aquí ha sido muy importante concebir ese aprendizaje entre los productores y los compradores o cadenas finales de valor en donde se hacen ajustes de acuerdo con las necesidades de cada cadena de valor. Entonces, lo que nosotros hemos estado teniendo como hitos específicos para encadenar el modelo de bioeconomía es el restablecimiento de la productividad, pero sobre todo inyectarle mucho más dinamismo a las cadenas de valor desde una palanca de cambio que se constituye realmente en el factor más importante del modelo, que es cambiar la mentalidad. La mentalidad ha estado muy centrada en lo que otros desde afuera pueden hacer y no en la generación de capacidades para que sea el mismo actor local quien genere su propia planificación o que en compañía de planifique, construya e implemente. Entonces, el modelo ha estado muy basado en esto, cambiar mentalidad, porque no son receptores, también son proveedores de conocimiento y dinamizadores del territorio. Y se ha centrado en 3 hitos muy importantes. Por un lado, el Centro de Innovación, que ha sido Bioinnova como apalancamiento, y el Centro de Desarrollo, en este caso, hay otros casos que fue Selvacéutica en un piloto muy específico de productos de biocosméticos. Por el otro lado, la generación de capacidades en entrenamiento y capacidades de construcción. Primero, porque las capacidades en infraestructuras no están establecidas, por lo tanto, certificar plantas de producción en esta región del país y en otras que se puede replicar era muy complejo, y entonces ha sido todo un entrenamiento para poder primero responder a esas necesidades del mercado, pero también adaptarse a una nueva dinámica, que es producir de acuerdo con las capacidades que hay en los territorios. Y un tercer hito de romper es cómo se conecta esto específicamente con el mercado. Y aquí quiero, antes de que se me termine el tiempo, contar aquí también una reinversión del concepto que se tiene de mercado. Normalmente, en estos procesos de construcción se cree en los pequeños emprendedores, que además hay un proceso de formación muy importante con otros aliados, y es que el mercado siempre está por fuera. Y realmente nosotros, cuando pensamos también en la huella de carbono, tenemos que pensar en los mercados locales. Hay productos y servicios que con una demanda local es suficiente para generar esa cadena de valor, pero sobre todo para generar ese aprendizaje, porque no es fácil. O sea, no es fácil tener a un productor y a un pequeño emprendimiento, a un pequeño emprendedor, en meterlos en toda la normatividad y en todas las exigencias que le demanda un mercado, ¿cierto? Digamos, de crecer y escalar de un momento a otro. Es un tema muy complicado, por lo tanto, en la comercialización hay un concepto de crecer aprendiendo. Y eso se ha generado también construyendo esa conciencia de que no todos los mercados están por fuera, que hay mercados pequeños que nos permiten los aprendizajes en diferentes aspectos. Bueno, entonces, lo que ha generado este modelo, yo lo concibo como un planeta que ha generado la movilización de los diferentes ejes de articulación, en donde a partir de la conexión de un centro de innovación e investigación y un centro de desarrollo, se permitió que pequeños emprendimientos generaran valor agregado y que estos pequeños emprendimientos jalaran a más de cientos de productores por la relación directa que se tiene para que el modelo pueda crecer. La siguiente. Bueno, y finalmente, ya nos queda solamente un minuto, contarles en esta diapositiva, la anterior, Cata, creo que. Contarles en esta diapositiva, y es que el cambio, la palanca de cambio, que es el cambio de mentalidad, primero promueve la confianza a través de diferentes acciones y eventos al interior de los actores locales que participan en este ecosistema, y esto generó el reconocimiento del modelo en los premios verdes de Latinoamérica, que finalmente también ha permitido generar confianza, porque la última diapositiva, porque como resultado de esto, cuando nosotros, la que sigue, Cata, la que sigue, la que sí. Cuando nosotros vemos lo que realmente ha generado un éxito en el modelo es que hay resultados concretos. Y esos resultados concretos en una primera fase se ven manifestados en que se generaron 15 nuevos emprendimientos con desarrollo de servicios con valor agregado y productos, 28 nuevos productos que pueden tener competencia local, nacional e internacional, movilizando a 600 entrenados, a 600 productores, que con una inversión de $1 millón, esa cadena de valor en este momento está facturando $1 millón en un rango de 2 años. Entonces, eso es un poco lo que nosotros queremos ir posicionando como en el cambio de mentalidad, porque finalmente el impacto que se quiere tener es que un modelo de bioeconomía que sea escalable, ¿cierto? Que habilite y atienda las necesidades colectivas e individuales del territorio, que genere un impacto y beneficios sobre lo social, ambiental y económico, y genera confianza sobre todo un territorio en donde la mayoría de las conceptualizaciones han estado centradas sobre un modelo de corrupción. Y esto es empezar a mirar el territorio de una manera distinta y empezar a empoderar a los actores propios del territorio, que al final, con buena información, se toman buenas decisiones en los diferentes niveles del Estado para poder reducir las brechas que hay en las poblaciones marginadas y en las poblaciones vulnerables.
Thank you so much, Minister Torres, for giving us a very detailed overview of your work and the bioeconomy model. Now, I would like to introduce our third speaker, Professor Carlos Nobre. Professor Nobre from Brazil is one of the most renowned Earth system scientists in the world, and he obtained his PhD in meteorology from MIT. Professor Nobre is recognized for his work on biosphere-atmosphere interactions and climate impacts of Amazon deforestation on the Earth system, and he has been a pioneer in the creation and implementation of important scientific experiments in the region. Among many prestigious public and academic positions, he has been a member of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, and was one of the authors of the 4th assessment report that led to the recognition of the IPCC with the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. He was also National Secretary for Research, Development Policies at the Ministry of Science, Technology, and Innovation of Brazil, and was the president of Brazil's Agency for Postgraduate Education. He is a foreign member of the US National Academy of Sciences, a member of the Brazilian Academy of Sciences, and a member of the World Academy of Sciences. So thank you so much, Professor Nobre, for joining us today. Welcome.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. Good afternoon, buenas tardes a todos. Let me just start by saying it was really wonderful to see presentation by Minister Murillo and Minister Torres, because I can see, and congratulations to Colombia. Colombia is way ahead of any other Amazonian countries in searching a sustainable development pathway. So I'm going to talk about how close we are to the tipping point, but really, you know, and Minister Torres really addressed this issue. We need a novel circular bioeconomy of standing forests. And I call this initiative, like, you know, Colombia is doing very well, the Amazon Green Deal. We have the post-pandemic, everyone is talking about the world needs a Green Deal, European Green Deal, US Green New Deal that everybody's expecting also. So, but the Amazon really badly and urgently needs to reach this Green Deal. Let me see, yeah. So basically, as we know very well, our current economic system does not value nature. So we need this new Green Deal, how to transform Amazonian countries in environmental powers of social biodiversity, as very well posed by Minister Murillo and Torres. We have to value traditional knowledge, we have to value traditional populations. let me start by saying, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but just what science tells us is the Amazon forest only exists because the forest exists. There is key evolutionary accomplishments, very efficient recycling of water, very efficient recycling of nutrients. Most 84% of the Amazon soils in Brazil, they are very poor, very nutrient poor, but the forests develop over tens of millions of years this fantastic capacity to recycle all nutrients. So this is unique of tropical forests, particularly the Amazon forest. However, in the last 50 years, we are seeing this new development model started in Brazil in the early 70s and then spread to most of the other Amazonian countries. And in 1990-91, I published papers that at that time looked something distant in the future, in which I posed the Amazon savanization hypothesis. And in particular, the area there you see in blue on the right-hand side diagram, if we deforest the Amazon, that area would never become a forest again. It would turn into a tropical savanna, which is the biome in equilibrium with a drier climate, a longer dry season. So today we have something like 17% of the Amazon already clear cut, something like 8 to 10% highly degraded. And you can see there the map of deforestation. Some people may say, well, only 17%, no problem. Why? Wait, we can deforest a lot. We can deforest 50%, no problem. But that's unfortunately not the case. In this type of research, there is plenty of research today showing the risks of this savanization. Let's say the forest, we used to have 6.2 million square kilometers of forest, the rainforest, and the risk of savanization will only keep something like 30% of the forest, Western Amazon, near the Andes, because the rainfall there is very abundant and it would survive this savanization. But 70% would become a degraded savanna, tropical savanna, with much less biodiversity than the tropical savanna of Central South America. So why is that so? Because of this synergistic impact of global warming related climate change, which is increase in temperature in the North Tropical Atlantic because the Gulf Stream is slowing down. And this implies an effect on the Amazon. Most of the Amazon, 70% of the Amazon will become drier with a longer dry season. And also on the top of that, regional deforestation reduces rainfall, reduces water recycling. When you put these two things together, acting synergistically, then we can say the Amazon has already, the tipping point of Amazon savanization has already been activated. And we know it has been activated. I'm just summarizing here very briefly the extreme, what we know from observations: extreme climate events, droughts and floods, more frequent, dry season in southern Amazon, longer, 3-4 weeks. Forests in southern Amazon are not recycling water as efficiently, are removing less carbon, mortality rate of tree species are increasing, and also we have seen savanization of sauna. This is 2 papers published in the last 2 weeks. There is a lot of evidence of the savanization increasing. So we are making many warnings. In this particular paper, we say do not exceed 20-25% of regional deforestation. As I said, we are at 17%. Can we avoid this tipping point? So we have to really pick, and I'm very glad to hear Mr. Murillo and Torres, because they basically, it's clear that at least Colombia is trying to look at this utopia, although of course this project is mostly the Pacific rainforest, but also in the Amazon rainforest of Colombia. They have this idea of reducing deforestation to zero, restoring, or we can think of a dystopic scenario that's pretty much going on in Brazil, in Bolivia, and also in Peru. So is it possible to zero deforestation, economic development? In the Amazon, we can look at two very opposed land use models. One is what we call first way. It's the conservation in indigenous territories. 47% of the Amazon is protected indigenous territories and protected areas. Or the second way, we call second way, resource intensive development, agribusiness, extractivism, mining, hydropower plants. Is it necessary to get rid of the forests? So this is the Amazon deforestation, Brazilian Amazon deforestation. So this is about 20% already clear cut. So basically the question is that for 20 years, everybody have been talking about these two ways, but they are necessary improvements, but they are not sufficient. So what else? So that's what we are proposing, a solution space, forest restoration, and standing forest bioeconomy, a circular standing forest bioeconomy. And this is a proposal we are putting forth. It's very similar to what Minister Torres mentioned, and we are behind Colombia. I'm very glad to see Colombia is ahead. So we call Amazonia 4.0. And basically the question is simple, to ask the question, what's the potential of a biodiversity-driven bioeconomy to produce value-added products in many industries, including genetic resources. Perhaps the medium to long-term highest economic potential in the Amazon is genetic resource. Why is that so? Well, for the obvious reason, the Amazon holds the largest biodiversity of the planet. Most people do not know that, but let's see. 1 hectare, 10,000 square meters, 1 football pitch, has more angiosperms, tree plants with flowers, than all of Europe. And we may always ask the question, what's the potential? Well, so let's look at the numbers, the figures we have already. I'm sure Minister Torres has also those figures for those products, forest products that Colombia is developing. But let me give you some figures here comparing acai berry, Brazil nuts, cocoa with cattle and soy in Brazilian Amazon. And these are, acai berry has become an emergent global product, $1 billion, $1.1 billion to the Brazilian Amazon a year, benefiting 300,000 people. So this is the official government census of agriculture in the Amazon. This 2017, 5 Amazonian states in Brazil, they produce $4.4 billion in 2017, use 240,000 square kilometers, $183 per hectare per year. And now acai berry, cocoa, and Brazil nuts, $5.1 billion, $1.6 billion, and then only less than 4,000 square kilometers, $3,300 US. This is official data. So it's ridiculous to insist in a model that really clears the forest. So we have really to think about the forest, intact forest, but also all of the Amazon's 1 million square kilometers already deforested. We have to think about agroecological systems which maintain 60% of biodiversity, 60 to 80% of carbon, and provide raw materials year-round. So, but the Amazonia 4.0 is really how to bring the modern technology, the fourth industrial revolution, along with traditional knowledge to harness the biological biomimetic assets. That beautiful example from Colombia is exactly that. And this virtual cycle in the 21st century of knowledge. So this is our attempt to develop this value adding to forest products with innovative bioindustries. We want to bring, this is the number of communities, villages, cities, towns in Brazilian Amazon, all over the Amazon, it's over 6,000. So we have to think of a decentralized model of development. And of course, there are many, many challenges. How you bring fourth industrial revolution technologies, modern bioindustries to the hinterlands of the Amazon. There is isolation. We have challenges of infrastructure, logistics, how to add value with a complex process in quality, volume, how to access markets globally, how to keep equipment functioning, training people. So that's the challenge. But I think this is a challenge, and I'm very glad to hear Colombia is facing that challenge. And the Amazonia 4.0 has two components. We are starting those two components, Amazon Creative Labs and Rainforest Business School. Let me very briefly go through. Amazon Creative Labs are modern, let's say, mini biofabrics in value chains to do capacity development for local communities, also to do co-design and co-production of knowledge with traditional knowledge. So we are already constructing the first one, which is the cocoa cupuaçu. Cupuaçu is a close relative to cocoa, produce beautiful chocolates. We are constructing this first one, and we have designed one for Brazil nuts, one for genomics, the tremendous potential. We are going to start construction of this genomics lab, and also we designed for gourmet cooking oils and for acai berry. And there is a list of other products that we plan to construct. This cocoa cupuaçu, it's being constructed. It's a small biofabric, very modern, using modern technologies, solar energy, drone transportation. I'm not going to go into the details. We hope to finish this by February, and then we are going to move to the field. Minister Murillo, one of the communities that we are going to do capacity development is the Quilombo Mojumiri. It's an Afro-descendant Quilombola community. Also, the Women's Association of Producers of Cupuaçu, Amabela, the riverine community near Belém, also another riverine community in the extractivist reserve in the Tapajós River, and also at the end of the year, our fifth training activity will be with students at the University of the Amazon. So this is the idea is really to try to enlarge the development capacity through these labs in the field, showing it's possible to do bio-industrialization. So it's not only raw material, adding value, adding Amazon brand, and really reaching global markets. And the second component is the Rainforest Business School. You may even think this is kind of a slow management school turn to the special needs of sustainable entrepreneurship. It's a different, and also Minister Torres mentioned very good ideas, exactly what Colombia is doing along those lines. I was really impressed. So to finish, looking ahead, what's the real advantage of biodiversity countries like Colombia, Brazil, Peru, Bolivia, Suriname, Guyana, Venezuela, Ecuador, the Amazonian countries with very rich biodiversity? Brazil is #1 in biodiversity, Colombia is #2, Indonesia is #3. Or are we happy to remain forever provider of commodities to develop industrialized nations? I don't think so. We are not happy. So looking ahead, really, how we can emerge as global leaders, where we can emerge as global leaders by implementing a biodiversity-driven bioeconomy. It's a tropical bioeconomy with modern technology of the 21st century, but also, as both of those who preceded me in the talk made it very clear, empowering traditional people with traditional knowledge. So this is very important for planetary health, So let's really transform Amazonian countries in the first environmental powers of the social biodiversity. So basically, I'm ending here. So this is nature-based solutions, creating this novel circular bioeconomy, producing jobs, well-being, prosperity, protecting biodiversity, and combating climate change. Is this possible? Yes, it's possible. It's a big challenge, but we have really to overcome. We have to be fearless. We really have to move along those directions. And so this is basically a fusion of idealism, realism, and innovation. Innovation, including innovation of the traditional knowledge. Let me just finish by quoting a famous Brazilian geographer, late Professor Berta Becker, to add value to the heart of the forest, and also Dave Kopenhauer's indigenous leader, saving the heart of Mother Earth. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for your powerful opening presentations. I think it's great to be able to hear about the very real challenges affecting the Amazon, but also the pathways that are emerging to create more just, sustainable communities. So we have received many good questions from the audience, but I would like to open the Q&A session with a question about communities, given that you have all highlighted the importance of engaging with local communities. I would like to expand a bit on this. So when we talk about the people who live and depend on the rainforest, who are we talking about? And can you expand a bit on the characteristics of these communities? What are their needs and assets? And what is the nature of the key conflicts that affect them? Maybe we can start with a perspective from Colombia and then from Brazil.
Well, let me say something about communities. Obviously, when talking about I would say forest community, I will use that term. We are talking about indigenous, Afro-descendants, and also campesino communities that are in those areas, with some differences in culture, basically joining by the relationship with the nature. In the case of Colombia, we are talking about communities that were invisible until 1991, and then our communities got were recognized as an ethnic particular group with particular rights to land tenure, to the collective land title in the Pacific Coast and other areas when they have ancestral relationship with the land. 5 million hectares have been titled to Afro-Colombian communities. And in the case of indigenous communities, there's a tradition of indigenous reservation, resguardos indígenas, collective ownership, about 25 million hectares. So between these two communities, they own collectively almost 30% of the country, and 50% of the natural forests are in those communities. So that's a very particular communities that need very special protection and also rights.
If I say something about Brazil, also very similar to what Minister Murillo mentioned, we have hundreds of these, well, actually more than 1,000 of these communities, indigenous communities, Afro-descendants. And also, of course, Brazil had migrations in the 19th century of many people from other parts of Brazil for rubber extraction at that time. So these communities became forest communities as well. And one positive aspect is that the migrants that came in the 70s, brought by government to clear the forest and start cattle and crops, some of those communities abandoned the old way and also are developing agroecological systems. They are starting to realize themselves that, you know, a bioeconomy, a forest, standing forest bioeconomy is much more beneficial, and also their children are becoming more like forest people. And this is a very good news, although in small numbers, they are not most of the migrants that came in the 70s and the 80s. But anyway, we have starting to see good news that many of those communities are seeing the value of the forest.
Thank you, Professor Nobre. Minister Torres, would you like to add something, or we can go for the next question for you?
Yo quisiera agregar solamente hacer un aporte muy pequeño frente al tema de poder conservar los bosques y tener un aprovechamiento sostenible de los bosques, y es que nosotros tenemos un gran reto, es de considerar a los bosques como un sistema integral, no solamente como un proveedor de insumos, sino como un sistema integral. Y esto también está definido un poco por el conocimiento que deberíamos de tener de los bosques. El doctor Carlos, el profe Carlos Nobre lo mencionaba, y yo creo que es súper importante que nosotros como humanidad reconozcamos todo el valor en la genética que hay en los bosques. Un poco el desaprovechamiento que tenemos de los bosques es porque nosotros no sabemos el valor como sociedad. Entonces ahí hay un reto muy grande, y es primero nosotros debemos de conocer la importancia de los bosques, porque muchas veces esto se nos queda en campañas de conservación, pero estas campañas realmente las tenemos que empezar a hacer desde el conocimiento. O sea, nosotros tenemos que empezar a trabajar en temas de proteómica, de genómica, de metabolómica también, para reconocer, porque detrás también de los conocimientos ancestrales que tienen las comunidades, que ha habido una muy buena estrategia de conservación y que está ligado muy a la dinámica de los usos y costumbres, y que si bien es cierto, nosotros tenemos que reconocer también que el mundo cada vez está demandando más servicios, demandando más alimento, demandando más todo, demandando más tecnología, y que no nos podemos como sustraer de un movimiento mundial, ¿cierto? Este movimiento mundial que nos dirige muchas veces al tema del consumo masivo, ¿sí? Pero entonces, si nosotros lanzamos estas estrategias que nos permitan hacer más el reconocimiento del bosque como tal, como la función que cumple y no solamente como un proveedor, vamos a generar muchísima más conciencia. Pero por el otro lado, una gran reflexión es cómo nosotros estamos transfiriendo esto a nuestros jóvenes. Necesitamos incorporar más esta fuerza de los jóvenes, este reconocimiento de los jóvenes como parte de estas comunidades que muchas veces también se ven abortados del sistema. Entonces, un poco esas dos reflexiones para considerar lo que realmente hemos visto también desde una mirada muy romántica solamente, y claro, eso también es lo que nos ha generado el problema de no considerar a los bosques por su funcionalidad en sí.
Thank you, Minister Torres. I have a follow-up question for you that is, from your perspective, both as a scientist and as a woman leader heading the first Colombian Ministry of Science, and your long-lasting trajectory with bioprospecting research and sustainable development in the rainforest, like, what role do you see for academia in the challenges we're discussing today? And how can researchers and scientists meaningfully engage with policymakers and local communities to promote inclusive and sustainable development?
Bueno, yo creo que en este punto en el que tenemos crisis mundiales muy importantes frente al tema de la conservación, y bueno, que nos meten en estos dilemas de si conservar o producir, hay un elemento muy importante, y es que cada vez la política se tiene que academizar más, y cada vez la academia se debe politizar más. Yo creo que estos sistemas complementarios nos deben de llevar, justo mucho desde la experiencia que he tenido como ministra, a cómo empezar a trabajar de la mano del legislativo. Yo creo que para lograrlo es muy importante hacer estos enlaces con el legislativo, porque desde aquí realmente se generan las políticas y las acciones de implementación. Y bueno, ha sido una experiencia también muy valiosa desde el ministerio ser primero una investigadora, tener toda esa trayectoria, casi 30 años de investigación, y tener que estar en un lugar en donde se toman decisiones políticas, en donde se toman decisiones como país. Y un poco lo que yo veo desde lo que se ha hecho desde este modelo de bioeconomía es que tenemos un desafío grande y es escalar. Que estas experiencias no se nos queden como experiencias puntuales. Estas experiencias tienen que trascender, estas experiencias tienen que replicarse en otros territorios, sobre todo en esta relación de poder motivar e incentivar a los administradores locales de que hay una oportunidad en el uso, en el aprovechamiento y en la conservación de la biodiversidad. Y eso es una decisión política. Y es una decisión política porque finalmente son los administradores de los locales, tanto gobernadores, porque en Colombia tenemos un sistema de administración que va más allá de la estructura política y que trasciende las organizaciones étnico-territoriales, los resguardos indígenas, los territorios, por ejemplo, nosotros tenemos una figura en Colombia que son los territorios colectivos, que creo que no existen en ningún otro lugar del mundo. Eso hay que considerarlo dentro de la planificación. Entonces, cada vez se hace más necesaria esta conversación y esta pedagogía entre los tomadores de decisiones como un valor que debe dársela a una relación para poder generar implementaciones eficientes. Y quiero cerrar la respuesta con una práctica. Es planes de desarrollo, por ejemplo. Nosotros logramos este año, a través de un instrumento que le llamamos la ruta territorial, que el 91% de los departamentos, de los gobernadores y casi el 50% de los municipios incluyeran en su plan de desarrollo un capítulo o subcapítulo de ciencia, tecnología e innovación. Y esto para decir, esto es histórico, en Colombia no llegábamos al 30%. Esto para decir que necesitamos más de estas relaciones y necesitamos más visibilizar, porque muchas veces las decisiones se toman desde el desconocimiento. Y eso es un poco el papel que debe tener la academia para poder lograr esta articulación con la política.
Thank you, Minister Torres. I will now move to some of the questions that we have received from the audience. One of the first questions we got is for Minister Murillo. So, Minister Murillo, could you speak a bit more about how carbon offsets funds could be further leveraged to benefit the Amazon? And are there ways that offset funding could be harmful?
Well, I concur with Minister Torres that it's very important to work with the legislative body. We were able to get approved a law that created the carbon tax. And within the carbon tax, then we included this offset mechanism to support RED projects, RED Plus, reduction of emission for deforestation and degradation, but not directly assigning those resources to the government, but having their leverage for a voluntary carbon emission market. And that have been working very well because the agent of these markets are communities, those who structure the projects, and then they register the project and get approval for offset. Those funds doesn't go to the government treasury. That's a very important mechanism to address, at least to transfer resources to communities and areas of where you have a strategic ecosystem. But further development needs to be done in terms of more regulation to protect that market and also avoid the abuse of position of certain agents within that carbon market. That's one of the risks of having this mechanism. But it seems to us that the mechanism have been very efficient. Almost 40% of the resources for the national carbon tax already went to projects that support conservation in communities, both Afro-descendant and indigenous communities, but particularly in the Pacific coast. And the reason for that is that in the Pacific coast, they were more active and they have more assistance from, at that time, from getting this project ready. But the the challenge now is how to promote this voluntary market, carbon market, to really cover areas in the Amazon.
Thank you, Minister Murillo. And I would like to follow up with a question from the audience for Carlos Nobre, but then we could also hear a perspective from Colombia, which is, what is the connection between the efforts to promote biosustainable economic activities and the terrible murders of hundreds of environmental leaders in the Amazon region? And what type of policy solutions do you think could be pushed to stop this violent tendency?
Yes, unfortunately, Brazil for several years was leading as a country with the highest assassinations of environmental leaders in the Amazon, also indigenous leaders. And this really shows also the social tipping point that we are at, mostly Brazil, but also some other Amazonian countries, in which the dominant mode of the last 50 years really has a lot of political power, local political power. A lot of the state level legislators and mayors of the areas in the frontier between the deforestation and the intact forests, they really put a lot of pressure for continuing expansion of commodities frontier, mining, mostly illegal mining. So the assassination of these leaders represent really the expression of the political power of a lot of these people. So we have really to also to avoid this social tipping point of organized crime, and unfortunately also organized crime in the Amazon is all connected. Recently it was found that some of these organized crime related to land grabbing, illegal mining is also associated with drug dealers all over Colombia and other countries. So we really, as countries, and I'm sure Minister Torres can answer that as well, because she's a minister of a government. How to fight back, because this is not a simple issue. How to reduce crime, organized crime, all sorts of organized crime. In Brazil, it's rampant. Land grabbing. Last year, 45% of deforestation in the Amazon was land grabbing, land speculation. We have in the Yanomami indigenous territory something like 20,000 wildcat miners bringing diseases, bringing COVID, bringing a lot of disturbance, capturing some of the teenagers, indigenous people to work there almost as semi-slaves, prostitution, drugs. So this is a big problem. This is really a big problem, and we have to attack that problem as nation and also collectively as Amazonian nations, because this is not only a Brazilian problem. This is all interconnected across the Amazonian countries. So perhaps this is one of the greatest challenges. Perhaps it's more difficult to fight, combat, and win the battle against organized crime than really bringing these new technologies and bringing industrialization to the Amazon. So still a major problem to be overcome. Perhaps, Minister Torres and Minister Murillo could also make comments about that.
Minister Murillo, would you like to complement?
Well, yeah, sure. Obviously, this is a transnational challenge because it's connected to illegal market of most of them. Obviously, illegal market and legal trade of legal mining. Obviously, legal trade of timber is connected with illegal wildlife trade, is connected with drug trafficking. as was mentioned. So the response needs to be collective. I think that the pact for the Amazonia that was signed recently is a good avenue for discussing this problem. But beyond that, it's very clear that there is a proposed for development of the Amazonia that doesn't concur with what we are talking about here. And they are powers of forces that are pushing for an own model of development. And it's based on, in the case of Colombia, in land grabbing for cattle ranching and for speculation with land. And to respond to that, the first thing is to build trust with communities, because all the Amazonian state, particularly in the northern Amazonia, they don't have a strong presence in those areas, and are communities that really are the ones with the legitimacy and presence in those areas. And alliance with those communities and trust with those communities are important, and there are mechanisms to do that. One mechanism that some countries are rejecting is signing an implementation of the Escazú agreement. That precisely is the purpose of this agreement is to have more transparency in environmental issues, to have access to information for these communities, to have environmental justice, and to protect social leaders. And that's very important to do. Something that the region is not doing and is going in the wrong direction from the political standpoint is that they are militarizing those responses and destroying the trust with communities that obviously make more difficult to create mechanisms to protect those leaders and those communities.
Thank you, Minister Murillo. I think we just have a few minutes, but I will ask one more question from the audience for Minister Torres, which is, I am interested in whether indigenous protocols of respect, reciprocity, and renewal are part of the business model that you presented, because they take time and which business is not always in favor of. So can you expand a little bit on this?
La pregunta es si los acuerdos que se hacen con las comunidades, para entender bien la pregunta, los acuerdos que se hacen con las comunidades son voluntarios.
Sí, que si los protocolos de respeto, reciprocidad, ¿cómo funcionan esos protocolos dentro del modelo que se está planteando?
Ah, ok. Bueno, sí. Entonces, nosotros tenemos, digamos, unos protocolos establecidos con las comunidades en el marco de que muchas de las comunidades, la forma de preservación de su conocimiento es conocimiento a través de la tradición oral, ¿no? Y eso es que a través de una nueva metodología, que además Colombia ha sido líder en eso, no es una metodología nueva, que se conoce como el diálogo de saberes, es como balancear y poner siempre en el escenario las responsabilidades, pero también poner en el escenario el valor, ¿no? El valor que tiene el conocimiento con las personas. Y claro, siempre estos acuerdos se han hecho sobre acuerdos que muchas veces no son pactos escritos, son pactos de tradición oral, en donde se respeta completamente los saberes tradicionales, pero en ejercicios tan bonitos yo quiero contar para ejemplificar un poco esto, como el tema de mejorar los sistemas productivos en el bajo atrato, un sistema específico que es el sistema de NID. En la misma comunidad se creó una empresa que hace por un lado extracción de pulpa de NID y que hace por el otro lado extracción de palmitos, que ahora ellos están vendiendo en la ciudad de Bogotá y en Medellín. Entonces, un poco para ilustrar esto es la comunidad, normalmente la manera como sea tradicionalmente, y el profe Carlos Nobre conoce esto, en el Brasil la forma de aprovechamiento del palmito es que se siembra y se corta, entonces se arrasa completamente la palma. En el bajo atrato, la comunidad tenía un sistema que fue respetado y que además fue articulado a través de una conversación de diálogos saberes entre este conocimiento científico que ayudó a mejorar el servicio, ayudó a mejorar el sistema, porque lo que la comunidad había observado es que cuando las palmas tienen más de 5 o 10 hijuelos, la productividad del fruto no es tan buena, en cantidad ni en calidad. Y con ese conocimiento lo que se hizo es revisar a través de un acompañamiento de investigadores cuál era como el sistema óptimo. Y lo que se logró es que sin que se sembraran ni sembraran más palmas ni se contaran todas las palmas, era que, por decir un número, se retiraban 10 hijuelos que se aprovechaban para extraer palmito y el resto se resembraban para extraer fruto. Entonces, dentro de estos protocolos, muchos de los pactos no están escritos, pero sí es a través de esta conversación se ayudan a las comunidades a mejorar sus sistemas productivos, que además ya estaban ahí, solamente desde la investigación lo que se está ayudando es a mejorar estos sistemas productivos, y los protocolos con las empresas también son protocolos en los que se llegan a acuerdos. Y se llegan a acuerdos porque ya hay muchas empresas visibles en Bogotá, cadenas de restaurantes, cadenas comerciales, en donde los acuerdos son respetados, y esto era lo que yo les contaba en principio. O sea, esto lo que ha permitido es mejorar los procesos de producción, porque las empresas inclusive, porque eso es una parte del modelo, sensibilizar a las empresas, y es, nosotros nunca hubiéramos podido llegar a este modelo si la empresa va a exigir que se necesita una calidad determinada, que ellos la necesitan con 5 centímetros de color rosado desde el principio. A través de esta conversación, las empresas empezaron a comprar el producto como estaba y empezaron a transferir estas mejoras a las comunidades. Y esos protocolos siempre se han respetado, por lo menos en el modelo que nosotros hemos estado implementando, porque siempre son acuerdos o escritos o acuerdos de palabra, en donde finalmente lo que ha permitido es retroalimentar un proceso de mejora de calidad del producto que se entregan a las empresas.
Thank you so much to all of you. And we are getting close to the end, so I will just pass it to John for his closing remarks.
Thank you so much, Marcela. Thank you for moderating this excellent session. And thank you to Ministra Torres, Ministro Murillo, Professor Nobre. I very much appreciate your time. Thank you for your presentations. And equally, and maybe even more so, thank you for the work that you continue to do to put us on a path away from a dystopic future for the Amazon and its people. I have copied into the chat for all attendees links if you would like to know more about what the Environmental Solutions Initiative is doing broadly, and also in particular what we are doing in nature-based solutions. Please visit those links. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this latest event of our series, People, Prosperity, and the Planet, the ESI is positioning itself to contribute to real and pragmatic solutions as soon as possible, as quickly as possible, both for the social health of marginalized communities in the Amazon and the ecological health of the Amazon forest. And several initiatives at MIT will only expand our commitments, new initiatives, including a new College of Computing, which will have a faculty cluster working in the environment, and the recently announced Climate Grand Challenges. Both of these initiatives have enormous ambitions to really contribute in a meaningful way to the challenges that we have in the environment globally. So stay tuned for more activities and events sponsored by the ESI. Thank you to everyone for joining us. Very much appreciate your attention, and enjoy the remainder of your day. Bye-bye.